as a quarterback, or did you just know from the history of the NFL, the way it was, you're going to have to change position?
I had no reason to think that I was going to play in the NFL because there was no precedent of that. There hadn't been a black quarterback in the NFL. And my thought is that if I was going to play beyond college, I was going to the Canadian League.
Welcome back to another episode of Behind the Pro. In this episode, I got to spend time with legendary player and coach Jimmy Raye. Jimmy Raye shared his journey to becoming the first black quarterback to win back-to-back national championships, coaching in the NFL for almost 40 years, plus much, much more. Don't forget to subscribe, and let's go Behind the Pro. So my cousin talked about the community, what it was like growing up, and he talked about how you and your brothers helped teach him and his brother Steve just different sports, that they knew baseball, but you had to teach them other sports. What was it like growing up in a community during that time where the kids around you would teach you about the game and you could learn so much from the older kids? What was that experience like?
Well, it was a process of living in a village, in a black village. We were fortunate enough to have an outstanding parks and recreation director by the name of Smith that ran Seabrook Park, and everybody kind of filtered through that program. The younger guys, I learned from Billy Boy McPherson and Ernest McNeil and Ronnie Chase Chalmers, and it was a process of the older guys taking the younger guys under their wings and teaching them the nuances of the game. And Monk Smith took care of the fundamentals of the game. So when the young guys came along, it was just natural that from what we had learned from the older guys, that we passed that along to the younger guys that were coming up in Seabrook Park.
So you get to E.E. Smith, and like you mentioned, there was no middle school football. Did you pick that you wanted to play quarterback, or was that your coach's decision? How did you end up playing quarterback?
Well, I was a quarterback in Little League football at Seabrook Park and was undefeated, was a good football player. But it was Little League, and then I dropped football, and I played on a junior high school team basketball, which was an organized sport, and so I had the football background from midget league, but I was more noted as a basketball player because in school that was the only sport that we had in junior high school, basketball, and I was the best basketball player at Washington Drive, and then that transitioned to E.E. Smith in the summer of my sophomore year of my grade year. I just picked up where I left off at Little League. I became the quarterback, but they had a senior quarterback, Thomas Berrien, that was the incumbent, was picked to be the starter.
Oh, wow. Now, you were all-state football, basketball, and baseball, right?
Right.
So coming out, you were offered a scholarship at Michigan State. We're going to get into that. But what were the opportunities like for someone at your level for basketball opportunities to play in college?
Well, I found out pretty quickly that 5'11", 5'10" basketball players didn't go very far. So that kind of helped make the decision on what sport I had some. It didn't take too long to figure out that if I was going to play beyond high school, that the best opportunity to play was football. Because when we went to the tryout for baseball for the Baltimore Orioles down in Lumberton, there were four of us that were picked by the scout in the area to try out for single A baseball. But my mom and dad cut that off pretty quickly that I was going to college. I wasn't going to pursue. Baseball was really big then, but they cut that off pretty quickly because going to single A baseball, you could have stayed there for 40 years and never made it to the bigs. And I wasn't a power hitter. I wasn't a guy. I was a good player. Could run the bases and field and speed and all that, but didn't see a bright future in baseball. And with my parents seeing that I was going to college, that kind of helped define what happened thereafter.
Yeah. So one of the things I learned from my research, and you talked about it. So coming up, I played in the East-West All-Star game, and I did not know that those All-Star games were segregated at the time. what was that? But you were voted, if I'm not mistaken, to play in the North-South game, but it would have been illegal for you to play. Do you mind kind of sharing what that was like during that time in terms of how the All-Star games were broken up and just what it meant to even be voted to play in that North-South game as a Black player and as a Black quarterback during that time?
Well, it was an honor to be selected or voted to play in it, but they ruled that I didn't play in the North Carolina High School Football Association. I played in the Negro High School Football Association. So because there was segregation, the North Carolina South Carolina Shrine game ruled that I was ineligible to play because I didn't play in the North Carolina High School Football Association. But the Black football part of that was the Negro High School Football Association, and they had an East-West Shrine game. The best players in the East played against the best players in the West, but it was a segregated game. It was all Black high school and high school players. So I played in that game. Me, myself, Ben Wright, Clifford Carmichael were the three players off of my high school team my senior year that got selected to play in that game. And then from Raleigh was Willie Pat White and Bo Crowder and Robert James from Raleigh, and then Newton McGill and Thurman Jones from Hillside and Durham. And so we were and also Stanley Bibby. I mean, we had an outstanding team, and I never gave it much thought. I mean, my dad said about the North Carolina South Carolina Shrine game. Well, they'll always find a way to keep us down, and so I let it go. I never thought any more about it.
Now, so when you're playing, you score 5 touchdowns, have this great, outstanding performance in the East-West All-Star game, and Coach Cal Stahl is there from Michigan State, who I found out later became the head coach at my alma mater, Wake Forest. How did that conversation go with Coach Stahl? Was it like, hey, enjoy your performance, we're going to offer you a full ride? What was that conversation like?
There was none. I played in the game, unbeknownst to me that there were any scouts there other than the normal scouts from the CIAA, the historical Black schools, meaning A&T and T and Morgan State and North Carolina Central. It was called North Carolina College at the time, and Johnson C. Smith, who three of those schools had offered me a scholarship before I ever played in the game. And then when I played in the game, I think the game was in Durham. I think the game was played in Durham, the Durham County Stadium. And my introduction to Cal Stoll was when I was voted the most outstanding player of the game. He presented trophy and the award for the most outstanding player of the game, and then that's what started their conversation. Or I say their conversation because it wasn't anything that I had expected. That's what started their conversation of recruiting of me to come to Michigan State.
What was the final decision maker for you deciding on Michigan State versus the other 3 schools, Central and some of the others that you had mentioned?
Well, it's interesting. Charlie Sanders, my dear friend, may he rest in peace, from Greensboro Dudley High School, and his cousin Lou Hudson we went to visit the University of Minnesota. That's where I wanted to go because Sandy Stevens had played quarterback at Minnesota and played in the Rose Bowl. And that's when I first realized that there was a chance that a Black guy could play for a white school at quarterback. So when Charlie and I went to visit Minnesota, that was where I thought if I was going to be offered a scholarship, that's where I wanted to go because I knew Sandy had played quarterback, didn't switch his position. But Sandy was from Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and was a great player. He was the first Black All-American quarterback in the country, and played in the Rose Bowl, and they won the national championship in '61. So Lou Hudson was already at Minnesota, and he was Charlie's cousin. And so we went up there and they showed us around and all that. And I was thinking, well, if they offer me, this is where I'm going. And then later, I took a trip to Michigan State because they were recruiting, Minnesota was recruiting another Black quarterback out of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, named Craig Curry. And it was a matter of if they were going to get him, they were going to take him over me. I didn't know that then, but I found that out later. But I went to visit Michigan State, and when I got there were far more Black players at Michigan State than there were at Minnesota. Bobby Bell was at Minnesota, Carl Eller was at Minnesota, and Sandy, those were the stars. But other than that, there wasn't maybe 2 or 3 other Black guys. But I went to Michigan State, and visit. And there was Bubba Smith and Gene Washington and Clinton Jones and George Webster and Jimmy Summers and Jimmy Garrett. And most of those guys were from the South, either Texas, Virginia, or South Carolina. So I thought, well, this looks pretty good. I mean, but Michigan State had a 6-4 record that year that they were recruiting me, and then my recruiting was interrupted in November because Michigan State was playing Illinois for the Big Ten championship and the right to go to the Rose Bowl. And November 23rd, President Kennedy got killed, and so my senior year in November, when he got killed, when the president got assassinated, everything stopped, and they canceled the game of Illinois, Michigan State, and then played it the next Monday, and Illinois won, and with Dick Buckus and all them, they went on to the Rose Bowl. And then after that period, Michigan State started back recruiting me again, but I didn't really go back to visit Michigan State until May or June. And at that time, I had visited Tennessee State and Eldridge Dickey from Houston, Texas. Eldridge was at Southern University and transferred to Tennessee State. And so that was out. And then Coach Eddie McGurk from Johnson C. Smith came to visit. And I had a homeboy that was at Johnson C. Smith. And Curly Neal, we called him Curly, but he was Freddie Neal then from Greensboro Dudley. He was at Johnson C. Smith. Coach Riddick from Central and Bert Pickett from A&T, they all put the full court press on me and my parents that I didn't need to go up to the Big Ten or go that far away from home to go play football and that big fish little pond story deal, and you'll be back and whatever. And so at that point, my mom and dad said, well, if Duffy Daugherty is going to let you be a quarterback, you're going to play the position you play. And if that's where you want to go, you can go. That's how it evolved. But it was a lot more stressful during that time. But eventually, that's the way it all ended out. And one of your alumni, Bob Grant, who I had played against all through high school, he was being recruited by Michigan State, and then the new guy that took over at Wake Forest, he thought I was too little to play. So he took Butch Henry and Bob Grant, and that went on to be a historical deal. But the first game that I started at Michigan State was against North Carolina State, my home state school that never recruited me, but the head coach at North Carolina State facilitated my being recruited by Michigan State. His name was Earl Edwards, and he had been a formal assistant under Duffy Daugherty at Michigan State before he got the North Carolina State job. And they're doing their due diligence in recruiting me because there was no film. If you didn't see a guy play in person, you had to go on people you trust on his ability. And for most of us coming out of the South, it was reputation. And you kept up with each other through the Afro-American newspaper and the Sheridan Black Football Network. So I knew the names of a lot of the guys that were at Michigan State because I had followed them in the Afro-American paper. Jimmy Garrett was from Columbia High School, was from Booker T. Washington High School in Columbia, South Carolina. Jimmy Summers was from Orangeburg, South Carolina. George Webster was from Anderson, South Carolina. Mad Dog Thornhill was from Roanoke, Virginia. Bob Tiny Moreland was from Maggie Walker in Richmond. And so I met all these guys when I was up there, and I thought, this is pretty cool. So, but they discouraged me from coming. They told me, well, don't come here. If you want to be a quarterback, don't come. But they didn't know that I had already decided I was going to come. And so it wasn't an option. It wasn't an option whether I was going or not going. But I never told them that.
Now, you talked about NC State being your first start and they didn't recruit you. So I kind of have an idea, but I want to ask, how big of a chip did you bring into that game on your shoulder? Because, we all had those moments against those schools where, you didn't recruit me, or, you should have, you didn't have great opportunities and you got a chance to stick it to them. Is that kind of what happened in that game?
Well, yes and no. But I never really expected to be recruited by North Carolina State or North Carolina University of North Carolina or Duke or any of those schools because it had never happened before. So the weight of the world was on, the weight of the world was on my shoulders because I felt a need to prove that I was good enough to play at those schools. And so the start was more important to me because it was against the schools that had rejected black athletes, giving them a scholarship because it was against the law to give a scholarship to a black athlete in the ACC until Bob and Butch Henry went to Wake Forest. So that started in that game, and it just coincidentally happened to be against a guy that helped me get to Michigan State and a state school. Uh, there was a sense of urgency to perform and play well.
So you get the East Land. What was that transition like coming from the South, coming from that segregated environment? That's one part of it. But then just the weather change. I mean, you're going to a whole different environment. I mean, how did you visit Minnesota and those areas and think, man, this is where I wanna be?
Well, because I had it in my mind that I was good enough to play at a large school and not have to follow in the footsteps of all the guys that had gone to HBCUs. And so I basically dismissed the weather, thinking not like you got to remember that when I went back to Michigan State, it was June, and so I was really under the impression
Okay.
that it wasn't that bad. Minnesota was, and so that was one of the reasons why Michigan State was picked over Minnesota. But Charlie went to Minnesota because his cousin was there, Lou Hudson, the great basketball player, and Charlie went from there to the Detroit Lions and from there to the Hall of Fame. And we had battled all through high school, but we never met in college. We never played against each other in college until my senior year. And so when I first encountered the weather, I think the thing that when I got to East Lansing and met all of the other freshmen, you got to remember back then that freshmen wasn't eligible. So we never had to compete against the varsity players because we weren't going to play in any games, and all we did was we were taken up there on Monday for the guys that didn't play in the game to scrimmage against the varsity guys, the backup guys that didn't get playing time in the game on Saturday. On Monday, we had to go up there and get our brains beat in by those guys. They were mad because they didn't get in the game, and doubly mad that they had to play scrimmage against us. So that was kind of my introduction to it. But I remember being there, and they had the practice fields across from the dorms that we were staying in when I transitioned from the Grand Trunk railroad station to the campus. The practice fields were enclosed with these big green tarps. You couldn't see inside the chain link fence. And so the next morning, the freshman football coach got us all up, and we were going to take a look at the varsity. And they opened the gates. We walked from the dormitory we were staying in across the street around to the practice field. And they opened the gates. We saw the varsity team, and I said, "Oh my God, what did I do?" I, I said, "What did I get myself into?" I mean, they look like giants. I mean, they were practicing in their green sweats, tops and bottoms, and they were huge. I mean, they just looked like I'd never seen that many big people in my life. But fortunately for us, we didn't. Freshmen wasn't eligible, so we really didn't compete against the varsity players until spring football. And by that time, the acclimation process had taken place a little bit, and I had played quarterback all during the freshman year and won the most valuable player award on the freshman team. So I fully expected to be a quarterback on the varsity.
What style of offense did you guys run during that time?
We ran the unbalanced line offense with one wide receiver and a full house backfield, three running backs in the backfield, a left halfback, a fullback, and a right halfback, and we ran the option basically. But when I went up to the varsity, they changed the option, and we ran what he called the buck bootleg series, where it was off the fullback buck up the middle, and then the cross scissor action off of that, and then the quarterback would bootleg off of that action and get out on the edge, and I could run. I could really run then, and so that's what we evolved to.
Yeah, they put you out in space.
Yeah.
That's what it sounds like. So with that style of offense, I want to well before we get to that, I want to back up just a little bit and talk about someone. Typically, that relationship between head coach, and quarterback is very special. Talk about your high school coach at E. Smith, and who he was and his impact on your life.
Dennis D.T. Carter was a man ahead of his time. He was an icon, really. And my whole dream, my life after Seabrook Park was to become the starting quarterback at E. Smith and play for D.T. Carter. He was very instrumental in my my development as a high school player. We threw the ball more than most high school teams at that time because he was a visionary guy back in that time when people wasn't throwing the ball that much. We threw the ball, and that's really how I made my reputation as a passing as a throwing quarterback. And I got to college, and they made me or said I was a running quarterback. But D.T. Carter was very instrumental in my development as a high school player. And I think in high school, I think we lost. I know we tied 2 games and maybe lost one. We were pretty dominant in high school, and that led to my being selected to the East-West Shrine game and the North Carolina-South Carolina Shrine game. But Coach Carter was a great player in his own right back in his day, and he had a special bond with the quarterbacks that played at E. Smith. And my dream was to become the starting quarterback at E. Smith. But when I got there, there was a senior incumbent at the position, and he started the first game of the season. I replaced him at halftime of the first game, and then I started every other game after that.
So you're at Michigan State. You go through that first spring, and I want to fast forward a little bit to the national championship season. I think it was 65 was the first one.
Yeah.
You're going through that season as the quarterback. Were there expectations of national championship that year?
Well, in '65 there wasn't. We were when we started the season in '65. Our goal was to have a winning season. And as the season unfolded, when we got to be 4-0 or 5-0, there was a possibility that if we won the Big Ten championship, that we could go to the Rose Bowl. And so that was the driving force from where we started in the early fall practice in August. We couldn't dare think about a national championship. I mean, we had to think about trying to have a winning season, winning the Big Ten championship. And so unfortunately that happened, and we went to the Rose Bowl. And then the next year in '66, because the Big Ten at that time had a no repeat rule for academic reasons, that if you went to the Rose Bowl the previous year, you couldn't return. You couldn't go back twice, even though you were conference champions. So the Notre Dame game, we were both undefeated at the end of the year. The Notre Dame game became our quest to become national champions. But at that time, Michigan State had an exclusive pact with the Rose Bowl. The Big Ten did. If you didn't go to the Rose Bowl, you couldn't go to any other bowl game. And Notre Dame didn't go to bowl games back in that time because of their administrative policy. So really, the 10 tie game for the game of the century, played for the national championship in East Lansing, was really our bowl game. That was our national championship game. But when that game was over, we went home. It wasn't anything. Wasn't any bowl game, or Orange Bowl, the Fiesta Bowl, or any of those. You could only play in the Rose Bowl, and they sent the second place team, which was Purdue with Bob Greasy. they sent them to the Rose Bowl because they finished second behind us, and they played Southern Cal in the Rose Bowl, and we went home.
And I've, in doing some research, found out that the bowl system was a little bit different then. You were crowned national champion and then went to a bowl game
Yes, the
versus
bowl was a
now
bonus.
it's
Yeah.
different. Yeah.
Yeah, the bowl game was a bonus. We were already voted national champions. 65, we were voted national champions. And UPI, AP, and UPI Bowl, they've had those two agencies pick the national championship, and we were voted national champions. So the bowl game was really kind of, the Rose Bowl was really kind of the bonus for winning the championship,
Hmm.
and we lost the game 14-12, but we were already had been voted the national champion, the MacArthur Bowl trophy winners of the national championship.
Wow. So were you guys able to really be engaged in the game if you had already been crowned national champions and the outcome, wouldn't have any negative impact on that? Or was it, hey, we're going to focus on having a good practice and having a good performance so it leads into off-season workout, so on and so forth?
Well, yeah, we were totally engaged and committed because the 54 team had won the Rose Bowl. I mean, winning the Rose Bowl at that time was the beacon of on the hill. I mean, that if you were Big Ten champions and you went to the Rose Bowl and you played the California school, the Rose Bowl carried a different significance. National championship thing was done, and now we wanted to be wanted to be the Big Ten Rose Bowl champions, and that was paramount in our preparation and what we thought we were going to do. The problem that we had that year was that the team that we played in the Rose Bowl, we had opened the season in East Lansing against UCLA. We played them the first game of the year in East Lansing and beat them. And so it was when we went to California to play the Rose Bowl, we were playing that team that we had beat earlier in the year. And I don't say that we took them light. We didn't play our best football game against them in the Rose Bowl, and they got up on us 14-0, and then we lost the game.
So you have this career, you back to back national champions. Were you guys the first back to back national champions?
I'm not sure about that. I think Alabama, Joe Namath and
Okay.
them at Alabama may have done it before. They come to mind, and
Okay.
Southern Cal with Mike Garrett and Pete Betso, they come to mind. I'm not sure, but I don't think we were the first
Okay.
back-to-back national champions. But you got to
So
realize it was done differently then. You were voted for by the Associated Press and the United in the UPI. It wasn't like it is today, where you have four teams that play for it actually on the field. You win it on the field. It's just like the 10 tie against Notre Dame. The reason that game I think has remained so significant in college football lore is because there was no overtime. So the game ended in a tie. Had it have been overtime and we played in overtime and the team had won, it would have just been another game for the national championship, and the winner would have been crowned. But people still remember the 10 tie versus Michigan State and Notre Dame as a national championship game because there was no overtime. It won't ever happen again because the game can't end in a tie now.
wow. So you're a part of a lot of historical moments in college football as a player. And so I want to talk about so you have this great career at Michigan State as a quarterback and the NFL. Did you did when it was time for that process, that draft process, and did you think then, hey, I'm going to the league as a quarterback, or did you just know from the history of the NFL, the way it was, you're going to have to change position?
Well, yeah, I mean, I had no reason to think that I was going to play in the NFL because there was no precedent of that. There hadn't been a black quarterback in the NFL. And my thought was is that if I was going to play beyond college, I was going to the Canadian League. The Montreal Alouettes had been in touch with me, and they had at that time, what they had was territorial rights, college players to bid against the NFL. And I figured that my best chances playing beyond college was going to Montreal or going to the Canadian Football League. And then I got drafted by the Rams I think they had 20 rounds or something back then. I got drafted in the 16th round. And the first call I got from Elroy Crazy Leg Hurst, who was the general manager of the Rams, was he welcomed me to the organization and said, "We think you'll be a fine defensive back. We plan to put you behind Eddie Metter, who was a free safety, and he will mentor you and think you have a bright future as a defensive back." And so then I had a decision to make. If I was going to go to Canada and play quarterback or go to the NFL and play defensive back, which I'd never done before. I never played defense. And so I talked to Duffy about it, and he said, "Well, you're a good enough athlete that you probably could play defense." And and so I thought, well, I can always go back to Canada. If I don't make it in the NFL as a defensive back, I can always go up to Canada and play. But it didn't work out that way. I got injured to the point where my career was derailed. But I made the decision to go to the NFL and try to play defensive back. And fortunate for me, the year that I was drafted in the NFL and went to training camp, the NFL went on strike. And so
Wow.
the only people in training camp were the rookies. And to have practice, I was the only guy that could play because they had to have a quarterback. I was the only guy that had played quarterback. So I got to play quarterback in the NFL with the Rams doing the while all the time that the players were out on strike. But then when they came back off of strike and came into camp, the first exhibition game, Roman Gabriel and Milt Plum and Carl Sweetan, they took over as quarterbacks, and they sent me back over the defense. So I was a quarterback for 4 weeks in training camp doing the strike, but then when the veterans came in, that was the end of it.
Now, you talked about your injury. I think it was a shoulder injury. I think I heard you mention in another interview. With that type of injury, if you were playing now and you had that same injury, is there the technology and the health care that you would have been able to come back from that and then not have such a negative impact on your career?
Yeah, because I mean, you're talking a long time ago, and they really didn't understand. What I had a compound fracture of my right arm, where the bone comes through and it's splintered, and so they had to rebuild the bone, would take some bone from my rib cage and build up the fractured area so that it would be firm and would support the weight of the wrist and the arm. And back then that was one of those operations where I had a cast on from my fingertips all the way up to my shoulder. And so when the arm came out of the cast, it looked like a spaghetti string. But I think now, if it in today's medicine, modern medicine, and athletic training and all of that, I think I would have come back. I would have been able to come back off of that injury. But at the time, I went to the best, who was considered the best doctor in the NFL, Dr. Norman Nixon, who had done the multiple surgeries on Joe Namath's knees. And so I felt pretty secure that he had done a good job and that I would be able to return to play. But they rushed me back the next season in training camp, and then I hurt it again. And that was the disqualifying part of my career as a football player. Fortunately for me, because if I hadn't gotten that injury, I might have got something more severe, because I was a fish out of water as a defensive back.
So, how did you transition into coaching?
No intentions at all of coaching. When I got injured, I went back to Michigan State to finish my degree, and I was going to get a master's in education, and my intentions were to go to law school. And what happened was I went there, enrolled in school. I had 12 credits or 12 units to complete my graduation, and then I enrolled in a master's program in administration of higher education. And that fall, while I was there, Duffy asked me, when I went by to see him, he asked me if I would come out and run the offensive scout team against the varsity football team, coached the offensive scout team, and I had a daughter at the time, and I said, make some extra money. I said, yeah, and then that developed into him wanting me to do some advanced scouting with the next opponent. So that was a part of it to make some more money. So I did that, and when I still didn't, I still had no thought about really coaching. I was just doing it to make the money. But what happened was at the end of that year that I did that, George Perlis, who later became head coach at Michigan State, left the staff and went to the Pittsburgh Steelers. And there was an opening on his staff. And so I get this call from Duffy to meet him for dinner at a restaurant near campus. And when I wondered what was going on, but I went, and he said, I think you have the makings of a fine coach, and take George's contract, and I'm going to give you $6,000 of it, and I'm going to give the other graduate assistant coach $6,000, and I'm going to split the rest amongst the staff, and you'll be on the coaching staff. And that's how I ended up in coaching.
Did you know then the legacy of your coaching career and what it would lead to?
Oh God, no!
Did you
I,
know then?
I, I was still getting my master's degree, and I was going to law school. I wouldn't for that coaching. I didn't want anything to do with that. And what happened was the second year that I was involved in it, he retired. Duffy retired from coaching after 21 years as head coach at Michigan State. He retired, and he told me that I had done a good job, and recommended me to the new guy that was coming in, and reluctantly I stayed on because I needed the money if I had planned on supporting my wife and daughter to go to law school. And so I stayed on, and then one thing had led to another, and I had some success, and so law school kind of went by the wayside, and I ended up so when I decided then, well, if I'm going to be a coach, I'm gonna be the best coach that I can be. I'm not gonna be the black coach, because back then, I think that was 71, 70, 71. They had just started to hire black coaches in Division I football, and there was one on the staff or two on the staff, but it was an anomaly. And so I decided, if I'm going to be a coach, I'm going to be a coach. I'm not going to be the black coach or the black recruiter. I'm going to be a coach. And that led me to building a foundation and a base to become a real good football coach. And then my career kind of took off.
To your point, you brought up something about the 70s, and that was when they started hiring black coaches in the college level, first of all. And I had a chance to spend some time again with Coach Bill Hayes. The Wake Forest connection was Wake Forest hired him, and a lot of people don't know he's the first black full-time coach in the ACC. And so, in spending some time with him, your name came up. He called you the greatest athlete he had ever seen in his life.
That's a stretch, but I'll take it. The older I get, the better I was. Yeah.
So, and now, but you were able to transition that to a great career. And so I went, when I started going back and looking at some of the things that you had done, and how did you last 30 plus years in the NFL as a coach, as a coordinator, and you coaching these great players, Eric Dickerson, so many other players, and you're also influencing a lot of other coaches. My coach from college, Jim Caldwell. How did you establish that longevity and that impact?
Well, I don't really know. I don't know, but I always thought when I was coaching that I learned early on that some guys can get a job and some guys can do a job. And so that distinction, I didn't want to be a guy always trying to get a job. I wanted to be a guy that could do a job and make that and become relevant through expertise and knowledge of being a very good football coach. And that took me on a path where I became a college offensive coordinator at the University of Wyoming and the University of Texas in Austin, and then to the NFL back when there were only three other black assistant coaches in the NFL. And so I made that leap to the NFL, knowing full well that at that time there were only, it was Lionel Taylor, Elnell Durden, Alan Webb, and myself. And there were more black scouts than there were black coaches. And so Elijah Pitts, who was also one of the coaches, one of the four black coaches in the league, took me under his wing, and we would meet with the scouts down at the Senior Bowl in Mobile, Alabama, because we couldn't go out at night to the clubs and that because of segregation and all of that was going on in Alabama. And so we talked it up and talked ball. And then I came to realize that I had, through Lionel Taylor, Lionel was a great receiver for the Denver Broncos. He's in the Denver Broncos Ring of Honor, and he was a guy that mentored me in my early years in the NFL. And I realized that I had something to offer as a coach, and there was a concrete ceiling, but at least I could do the best that I could do as a coach and stay relevant because I could do a job. There was no aspiring to become, at that early on, aspiring to become a coordinator or becoming a head coach, because that didn't happen in the NFL back in the middle 70s, late 70s. So that's kind of where that came from.
So when you talk about your experience coaching in the NFL and the difficulty of black coaches being hired and receiving opportunities in the NFL. Now, throughout the years, the NFL has come up with different policies and strategies to help kind of combat that. But one of the most popular has been the Rooney Rule over the years. When it first came out, what were your initial thoughts, and if that would be effective or not? What was your thoughts on that when it came out?
So I thought it was misguided. I thought it was a ceiling rather than a floor. I thought that it was and it proved to be true early on. It was proved to be somewhat of a token experience, rather than build a floor and a base for elevation in with black coaches. They put a ceiling on what the Rooney Rule was about, and all that had to be done by the clubs was to interview a black guy, and they were conforming to the rule. So it became a kind of a tokenism deal in most cases, and it got better as they refined it. Through the years, it got better. The opportunities didn't get any better because the goalposts kept changing. They changed the goalposts during the time that I was at the peak of my coaching career. First, they said you had to have head coaching experience. Well, you couldn't have head coaching experience because there were no black head coaches. Then they said, well, you got to have been a coordinator. That became a criteria, and there were no black coordinators. Then Tony and I broke through. Lionel became a coordinator at Pittsburgh early in the early 80s, and then Tony Dungy and I were the two first black coordinators that faced off in the National Football League game when he was at the Steelers and I was at the Rams. And then they changed from you had to be it was always something. The goalposts always changed. It went from being a previous head coach to being a coordinator to being a play caller to being a whatever. It was always different, but the nepotism that existed in the league, it never affected the white coaches, and quite naturally there was no nepotism with black coaches because you didn't have any any relatives in the league. So so that was it's been an ongoing struggle. The Rooney Rule has served the purpose of it getting some exposure to black coaches, but it hadn't been the deterrent of the systemic racism that exists in the hiring practices in the NFL. It didn't address those issues. It didn't change any of that.
When you look across the coaching ranks and you see this ebb and flow of black head coaches and coordinators being hired, and one year you have a number and then the next year be next to none. Like, is there anything that can be any idea or just something that can help create this consistency in hiring an opportunity? Or do you think it's just going to, kind of have this ebb and flow?
Well, I didn't hear all of your question, but I think the denial of opportunity for black coaches has been apparent for 75, almost 100 years in the National Football League. And I think that will help change that is the more people that are in the pipeline and and they're very qualified now. So that can't be used as an excuse. Is ownership will have to understand that it's good for business. And until it starts affecting the bottom line, their pocketbooks, they're not going to be acceptable to change what has been predominantly done for the last 100 years. But I think the more and more success, Tony started it off, Jim Caldwell in Indianapolis, Lovie Smith at Chicago, Herm Edwards at New York Jets. The more success that black coaches have had and proven success that they've had will, in the long run, will be the thing that will be the saving grace for the young coaches that are coming along today, being given an opportunity been given the opportunity to head up a program.
Well, Coach, I appreciate you taking the time. I got one last question I want to ask you. It's kind of controversial. You coached a lot of great players throughout your career.
Yeah.
Who are you? You kind of know where I'm going. Who are your top 5 greatest ball players that you coached?
At the top of that list, well, I won't say he's number one, but at the top of that list would be Earl Campbell and Eric Dickerson, Marcus Allen, Tony Gonzalez, Curtis Martin, Will Shields, Vernon Davis. They would all be in the top 10. I was very fortunate to have been around great players and Hall of Fame players, and great players make good coaches. Plays don't work so well when Eric Dickerson ain't running them. But 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 there were some guys. There were a lot of guys. Joe Montana, Rich Gannon, Vince Ferragamo. There were any number of guys that I would pick and choose and go line up and play against anybody in the country. But it was a very rewarding time and had some great memories and great experiences along the way.
Would you do it again?
Oh, in today's market, I would. I mean, with the money that they're paying now, the money that they're paying coaches now, for sure, I would do it again. I think the athletes are a little different. I don't think
Yeah.
I think they are the new millennium athlete is a little different, but the financial rewards are far greater.
I watched the second half film, 10 game, the game of the century.
Uh-huh.
If you played now, would you see yourself as like more of a Patrick Mahomes or Michael Vick type player? Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes? Which style would you be playing if you were playing now?
Lamar Jackson, Russell Wilson, that Michael Vick, that category of quarterback and playing. Yeah.
Yeah.
An athlete playing the quarterback position.
Awesome. Well, look, I don't want to hold you up. I appreciate you taking the time. This has been wonderful.